In this video we're going to look at the exercise for the Interpreting Economic Data article on the national debt. We've got data here for the public sector net debt and GDP for the years immediately prior, during and after the Second World War, and what we want to do is to look at the effects of the war on the levels of national debt. Now, the first thing to note is that our debt figures and GDP figures are actually measured in different units. The debt figures are measured in billions of pounds and GDP is measured in millions of pounds. It's going to make it much easier if we convert one of the series to the units of the other so that we can make comparisons. So what I'm going to do is convert the public sector net debt figures to billions by multiplying by 1,000. Now, to do that, I take the figure for public sector net debt in this cell here and multiply by 1,000, and that gives me the figure in millions. And now I'm going to copy that down here, and that will give me my debt figures in millions of pounds so I can make a comparison with the GDP figures. Now, the first question asks me to calculate the ratio of national debt to GDP for each of the years shown. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my figure for national debt, now in millions, divide that by the figure for GDP and multiply by 100 to express this as a percentage. Now, straight away we see that in 1938 debt was 156% of GDP. That's much higher than the figures we have for recent years. The reason for that is that the British economy was still to some extent recovering from the effects of the First World War at this period, so we still had very high levels of debt at the outbreak of the Second World War. If we copy this cell down, then we see that it was actually on a slightly declining trend in 1938. And we see that debt falls to 153% of GDP in 1939 and actually continued to fall during the first years of the war to 132% in 1940. But after that, the effects of the Second World War start to kick in, and the deficits the government runs start to increase the national debt, and we see it starts to rise again, and by 1944 it's risen to more than double the level of GDP at 211%. And it actually continues to rise up until 1947, so it takes some time for the effects of the war to work themselves out, and then it starts to decline again from 1948 onwards. And we saw that by 2006 it had fallen to about 40% of GDP. That wasn't, of course, a smooth fall. There were periods of time where it increased in between those periods. Now, we're asked to graph the debt-GDP ratio against time and interpret the results. So we can do that as follows. If we highlight the years here, and then highlight our calculations here, and then go to insert, we can insert a scatter diagram. Now, this sounds a bit odd, but we want to put the dates on the axis, so it's easier to do this as a scatter diagram. But I'm going to opt here for this option here, this continuous line. And if I do that, then it gives me a line graph of the debt-GDP ratio with the dates on the horizontal axis and the debt-GDP ratio on the vertical axis. And we can see from this the pattern that we noted before. Immediately prior to the war, we've got a debt-GDP ratio of about 150% on a slightly declining trend. It then starts to increase when the effects of the war kick in, and then with a slight lag it peaks just after the end of the war and then starts to decline again here.